policy. So the pendulum starts to always to swing. There's always a reaction and a counter reaction. And Donald Trump retires quietly, and people will think more and more about what he did and not what he said, and they're going to look at what Joe Biden is saying and is doing, and he will probably be the beneficiary of that,
right,
in whichever way he wants to capitalize on it.
Let's talk about what that Joe Biden could possibly be doing. This is a segue into your new piece in American Greatness, which you it's titled "Stabbing Hektor's Corpse." And it's really about, you mentioned earlier, sore losers. This is, in a way, about sore winning and overkill. Would you talk about the Grecian theme that you start off with, and how that could be applicable to forthcoming American politics?
You know, the greatest work of Western literature was its first, Homer's Iliad, and it's not the story of the Trojan War. It's a story of about 12 weeks. It's the wrath of Achilles in the last year of the war. And it's about this kind of Trojan hero, as a tragic figure. It wasn't his fault that Troy, it was his no good brother Paris that started it, that Troy's at war. But he's boastful, and he doesn't have the prowess that Achilles does. And he kills Achilles' best friend, Patroclus, and he boasts over the corpse. And he treats, he acts, boisterous and loud and a braggart, but he's actually a good person. He's trying to, do the right thing for Troy, and then he fights Achilles, and you know who's going to win. Nobody can beat Achilles. Achilles kills him, and then all of these cowardly Greeks come up and take their spears and they dip them in the blood of his corpse, and then Achilles wraps his ankles to a rope, and he threads a rope through his ankles, and he drags him when he gets bored. What am I going to do for the next hour? Let me go out to the chariot and start in again. He just drags him around and mutilates the body. And then finally, this is the point I'm getting to, Homer shows us that he grows up and he realizes we're all going to die, and that Hector has a family, and that what Hector did was wrong to Patroclus, but what he's doing is wrong too. That you made your point, you killed him, and now you're just violating all codes of decency. And what happens, there's an empathy that grows to Hector, and Homer's trying to tell us when it's all over with, Achilles has become a human again. He's become a person, and he's grown up, and he's given the body back to the family of Hector. But what we're seeing in our own group, and I have to be very careful whom I'm talking about, we have all these categories of people that are reasonable people. So we have Mitch McConnell. Okay, Donald Trump was reckless, and they had back and forth. But basically, Mitch got a lot of really good appointments that Donald Trump gave him, and he did his part, and Trump did, and it worked. And but now Trump is so beyond the pale, and Mitch says that, well, he incited. I don't think that would stand in a court, McConnell's allegations. But more importantly, when you start to do that, when he's going to be out of office, and people are saying, well, wait a minute. Is this true about what Peter Schweitzer just says, that his wife is deeply connected with her family's shipping company that has some kind of concession with the Chinese Communist Party while she's working for the U.S. government? And then going to that, and then we have Don Lemon, and he says, all, not the protesters, all of the Trump supporters are Nazi-like and Ku Klux Klan sympathizers. Okay, is that 1 out of 5 black men that voted for Trump? 1 out of 3 Latinos voted for somebody they thought would have a Klan agenda. And so you can see where we're going. And then we have all of these people, and I'm going to be very careful here, but I had a lot of people call me just because I wrote a book about Trump, and they thought I might know somebody, and I had a congressman that was on the hiring committee. Can you help me get a job? Can you write? Hey, Victor, so-and-so would be wonderful for this job. Could you write something? I don't get involved in that, and maybe, I'm out here in Selma. But my point is, there was a mad scramble to get into DOD, to NSC, to DOJ, to education, you name it, they wanted. And am I to assume that as they examined the 30-year career of Donald Trump and the campaign that they thought he was Little Lord Fauntleroy or something? I don't think so. So they knew exactly what they were getting in. Rex Tillerson lobbied like you won't believe to get that job.
Yeah.
And said things about, so they all lobbied. And then when they didn't do well, or it didn't work out for them, or the Trump in a narcissistic fit didn't appreciate their own genius, they quit. And almost to the person, they wrote memoirs, or they trashed him, or they said, that whether it's Scaramucci or Omarosa, or all of them.
Right.
And then they became the leaders of the never all that. Okay, fine, now he's gone, but why do we have to keep, why resign in the last 2 or 3 weeks? What does that show? All it means is you're going to make it more difficult for the transition. So why did Elaine Chao resign from transportation? All you're going to do, why couldn't she said, I disagree with the president. I don't think he should be impeached or convicted, but maybe he should have been censored. But if I'm going to stay and make sure that this is a smooth transition to help the country. What's wrong with that? I get it that she and her husband now don't like him, but I don't think that she would have said that in 2017.
Right.
And Donald Trump was just as controversial then as he is now. I think all of us, I took a lot of heat on November 6th on, I think it was Lori Ingram, saying, I think it's over with. And I think the election was lost in March and April when the voting laws were not scrutinized, that were being changed by judicial edict and bureaucratic executive orders and stuff like that, because you couldn't authenticate 100 million ballots that were used other than on election day. And according to usual rejection rates of 3 to 5%, and we weren't getting those. So it was assumed that there'd be a lot of ballots we couldn't. But I never made the argument that therefore you should over. But the point I'm getting is, I made my point. I think I wrote for NR on the 22nd of November that Trump should just quit and go down to Georgia. But what good would it do now to say, oh, you're stupid, you didn't do that? So what? I mean, everybody can be a genius in retrospect. But now what I don't like is that all of these people who supported him, who worked for him, now are part of some, I don't know, shaming, scapegoating effort. Oh, I never liked him. I never. And what's going to happen in 6 months?
Right. Well, there's some sort of wishful thinking too, like by doing that he will somehow go away politically.
How's going to go away? That's 74.
Right.
I tell you, who's going to go away? Probably my congressman, David Valdeo, in the next election.
Yeah.
A wonderful person, but he's not going to raise any money in a Democratic district. Right. None of his base is going to support him. I would be very surprised if Lynn Cheney is re-elected as whip. And if she is, she'll still be inert politically. Nobody's going to vote for her. Nobody, meaning 55, 60% of the Republicans. Yeah, it's nothing to do with the merits or whether it's just reality. And these people got so wound up in the frenzy, and they wrote all of this stuff. He's got to be impeached in one day. Okay, no evidence required, no special, as I said. Now he's going to be convicted, even though he's a private citizen. Constitution, if you read it fairly, it's pretty clear. It has no idea anybody would ever manipulate it or warp it to include that.
Right.
If he did something wrong while he's president, then let a federal attorney deal with it. But you know why they're doing it? They want to ban him. These champions of democracy want to make sure these so-called deplorables can never vote for him again. And so I get really tired of all this self-righteous sanctimoniousness. And there is a logic of the universe. People in the East call it karma. The Greeks called it nemesis. Christianity has different terms for it, I suppose. But it all works out to even things out. And we're going to see in 6 months that a lot of stuff Trump did, Biden will pretty much adapt. The things that were not so important, he'll reject and then make a big sanctimonious speech. He'll have cognitive moments. There'll be lying. There's going to be their versions of Steve Bannon and all of that, and Jim Mattis and Rex Tillerson. They'll have all of that. And the media then will be convicted of hypocrisy. And that's all coming. And it'll be amplified if Donald Trump just smiles and plays senior statesman, rather than goes back onto some kind of social media platform. And that would not be wise, I think, for him. But that's what's going to happen.
Victor, let's talk now about the one thing, it may just be the one thing that you were involved in with the Trump administration, and that was your appointment to the 1776 Commission, which came late, I think it was October maybe, but...
No, it was December
Was
right before Christmas, because I had to supply the background information. It had a life of about 3.5 weeks.
well,
When it got going.
It produced a report. We have a link to. The original link I prepared was from the White House, but I went back at 1 o'clock and it was already gone. So, but I do have a link to the full report. It's about 45 pages. It's in the show notes. But you and Larry Yarn, president of Hillsdale, is I believe the president of the commission, and Matt Spalding, executive director, a great historian. Would you talk about the report? And I think it's one of the great cultural achievements and efforts by the Trump administration, which had come a year earlier, but it is a counterattack in a way to the 1619 lunacy that came out earlier in the year. So talk about the report, please.
Very quickly, he appointed in December 16 people, and they were deliberately, unlike what the left said, they were from all different branches of experience, life, you name it. There were lawyers, there were scholars, there were active professors, there were retired politicians, there were activists, etc. And Carol Swain was the vice chairman. And there was a sense that, remember, because Trump had lost and it was in this acrimonious period, that it wouldn't last long. And it was, the subtext was that people were angry that the 1619 project sponsored, that Nicole Hannah Jones, the reporter who cooked this idea up that America was not created in 1776 or 1787, but rather 1619 when the first African-American slave landed in North America. So historians had already refuted that chapter and verse. It was completely discredited, but it was still in the schools. And so this commission was to go back and investigate that. And so when we started to meet, and because of the lockdown and COVID, we had to do this largely somewhere in Washington and met, but most of it was on Zoom. We had to have an immediate group. So Matt Spalding, the executive director, Vice Chairman Swain, and Larry Arndt got a group together and wrote it. And I was not part of the original initial composition, and they just canvassed the group. People gave ideas, what was important. They did a couple of rough drafts. Everybody in the commission, did sort of a track changes, and the thing started to evolve. And finally, it was pretty efficient. It was like a commission should be, bam, 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 and then get out. And so everybody had a different perspective. And then when the final draft was presented, each person was asked whether they accepted it or not. It was unanimous. And what was the point? What were the findings? It was tripartite. It said this was the Declaration was the founding of the idea of America in 1787, and the signing of the Constitution was the reification of that idealism. And then it showed what was the landscape at the time elsewhere in the world, where did the ideas come from, and how hard it was with 13 squabbling British colonies in the period of impoverishment, war, factionalism, to get them all on the same page when they were so different. Both climate, slavery, it was terrible. And then out of that conundrum, they managed to cobble together this brilliant constitution that's still with us, longest living democracy, and which, because they couldn't solve slavery, inevitably forced the country to face the ideals of the Declaration, all men are created equal. And so what we did then is, that was the first thing we did, is try to locate and explain why we got the Constitution, where it came from, how it works, why it's different than European democracies or republics. And then the second was, these are the challenges. These are the people in the last 233 years have had objections. The first was slavery. We talked about the people who owned slaves and what they said and refuted it. And then we said, and then came along people later that were fascist, and they said, that it's sloppy, that it lowers standards, and you have to have a super race, or you have to have an ironclad militarist, and we rejected that. And then we looked at communism and Marxism. It breeds inequality, it's liberty but not equality or fraternity, the way that the French Revolution was. How did that go? And then we turned to the 20th century and looked at more, and I think this is why the left got so angry. We said that there were lingering racism, not lingering, but endemic racism after the abolition of slavery. We talked about that challenge, that the idea that you judge a person on their superficial appearance rather than the content of their character was absurd. I should say here the most referenced people in the text were Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King, and we reference them in the context as none of them, neither one of them, I should say, said they wanted to reject the Constitution, that it was innately flawed, but rather that they kept clamoring and demanding that people of their generation live up to it and say, you know, we're not asking for a revolution, we're just asking you people, white people, to abide by your own rhetoric, which is what we emphasize. And then finally, I think this was most controversial, we said progressivism, late 19th and early 20th century, that thought human nature was fluid, changeable, mobile, had been pernicious because that was a force that relied on specialists, experts, bureaucrats, and tried to change or alter the Constitution, and still does, as we're going to see, I think, in the Biden administration very quickly. And then finally we said, you know, that identity politics is a betrayal of the idea that all men are created equal, declaration, and the Martin Luther King admonition that the content of our character is not the color of our skin. And yet here we are in 2021 picking and choosing people as good or bad or noble or ignoble on the basis of their superficial appearance.
Right.
So when Eugene Robinson says that the Trump supporters, Republicans, and he says mostly white, are going to have to be reprogrammed. You can imagine if you change the word white for another race, what would be the outcry? Yeah. And we're working on the premise right now that when you use the word white, no other race could be substituted for it because of supposed systematic bias. So that somebody who was born in Bakersfield, California 20 years ago, 40 years after the Civil Rights Movement, that person, and he's working, as a trucker at 20, and I know people who did that when I was a professor, then he's privileged. And you can say anything you want about him because it can be contextualized, but you can't say anything about, Jay-Z or anybody else, which you shouldn't, but they have so much more opportunity and privilege than he does.
Right.
Because this country is a plutocratic society. It's based on not birth or skin color. It's based on money. Money, money, money. And that gives you privilege and status. And that's just the way it is.
Victor, I saw on someone tweeting the other day, and I don't have this right, like most things, I don't have it right, but it was black conservatives are being called something to the effect of like white influence privileged, like they're...
Yes, I saw that, and they had to do the same about Cuban Americans and Hispanics. When 8 to 12 went from 8% black support to 12 and from 27 to 33%, then critical race theory has to make the necessary Marxist adjustments. So they go out of the old Marxist playbook and they said, this is false consciousness. So they don't really know what they're doing, but they're tricked into buying this bourgeoisie white value system, and they voted for Donald Trump. And how condescending and arrogant it is. So if the guy's out in Fresno County and he's a carpenter and he can't get work, or his wage has been fossilized for 3 years, and suddenly in 2017 he's making $18 an hour and everybody's begging for his labor, and he likes the guy who created those conditions, well then he's a fool. He doesn't understand that it would be much better to open the border and let everybody come in and destroy his wages. And